When God Was a Woman by Marilyn Stone, Chapter 1, Part 2. It was quite apparent that the myths and legends that grew from and were propagated by a religion in which the deity was female and revered as wise, valiant, powerful, and just, provided very different images of womanhood from those which we are offered by the male-oriented religions of today. A fortnight after the creation of the universe. As I considered the power of myth, it became increasingly difficult to avoid questioning the influential effects that the myths accompanying the religions that worship male deities had upon my own image of what it meant to be born a female, another Eve, progenitress of my childhood faith. As a child, I was told that Eve had been made from Adam's rib, brought into being to be his companion and helpmate, to keep him from being lonely, as if this assignment of permanent second mate, never to be captain, was not oppressive enough to my future plans as a developing member of society. I next learned that Eve was considered to be foolishly gullible. My elders explained that she had been easily tricked by the promises of the perfidious serpent. She defied God and provoked Adam to do the same, thus ruining a good thing, the previously blissful life in the Garden of Eden. Why Adam himself was never thought to be equally as foolish was apparently never worth discussing. But identifying with Eve, who was presented as the symbol of all women, the blame was in some mysterious way mine, and God, viewing the whole affair as my fault, chose to punish me by decreeing, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing and pain. You shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So even as a young girl, I was taught that because of Eve, when I grew up, I was to bear my children in pain and suffering. As if this was not a sufficient penalty, instead of receiving compassion, sympathy, or admiring respect for my courage, I was to experience this pain with guilt, the sin of my wrongdoing laid heavily upon me as punishment for simply being a woman, a daughter of Eve. To make matters worse, I was also supposed to accept the idea that men, as symbolized by Adam, in order to prevent any further foolishness on my part, were presented with the right to control me, to rule over me. According to the omnipotent male deity, whose righteousness and wisdom I was expected to admire and respect with a reverent awe, men were far wiser than women. Thus, my penitent, submissive position as a female was firmly established by page 3 of the nearly 1,000 pages of the Judeo-Christian Bible. But this original decree of male supremacy was only the beginning. The myth describing Eve's folly was not to be forgotten or ignored. We then studied the words of the prophets of the New Testament, who repeatedly utilized the legend of the loss of paradise to explain and even prove the natural inferiority of women. The lessons learned in the Garden of Eden were impressed upon us over and over again. Man was created first, woman was made for man, only man was made in God's image. According to the Bible and those who accepted it as the divine word, the male God favored men and had indeed designed them as naturally superior. Even now, I cannot help wondering how many times those passages from the New Testament were read from the authoritative position of a Sunday pulpit or from the family Bible that had been pulled down from the shelf by father or husband and a pious woman listened to. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach or to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed and then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 14. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Let the women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, so saith the law. And if they learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3, 7, and 9. Strangely enough, I never did become very religious, despite the continual efforts of Sunday school teachers. In fact, by the time I reached adolescence, I had rejected most of what the organized religions had to offer. But there was still something about the myth of Adam and Eve that lingered, seeming to pervade the culture at some deeper level. It appeared and reappeared as the symbolic foundation of poems and novels. It was visually interpreted in oils by the great masters whose paintings glowed from the slide projectors in my art history courses. Products were advertised in high fashion magazines, suggesting that if a woman wore the right perfume, she might be able to pull the whole disaster off all over again. It was even the basis of dull jokes in the Sunday comics. It seemed that everywhere woman was tempting man to do wrong. Our entire society agreed. Adam and Eve defined the images of men and women. Women were inherently conniving, contriving, and dangerously sexy, while gullible and somewhat simple-minded at the same time. They were in obvious need of a foreman to keep them in line, and thus divinely appointed, many men seemed quite willing. As I began to read other myths that explained the creation of life, stories that attributed the event to Nut or Hathor in Egypt, Namu or Nenhursag in Sumer, Mami, Tiamat, or Aruru in other parts of Mesopotamia, and Mawu in Africa, I begin to view the legend of Adam and Eve as just another fable, an innocent attempt to explain what happened at the very beginning of existence. But it was not long afterward that I began to understand how specifically contrived the details of this particular myth were. In 1960, mythologist Joseph Campbell commented on the Adam and Eve myth, writing, "This curious mythological idea, and the still more curious fact that for 2,000 years it was accepted throughout the Western world as the absolutely dependable account of an event that was supposed to have taken place about a fortnight after the creation of the universe, possesses forcefully the highly interesting question of the influence of conspicuously contrived counterfeit mythologies and the infections of mythology upon the structure of human belief and the consequent course of civilization." Professor Sciarra points out that the Bible does not give us one creation story, but several of them. The one which happens to be featured in chapter 1 of Genesis appears to be the one which had the least vogue among the common people. It was evidently produced in scholarly circles. He then discusses the differences between the religions of today and the ancient worship, saying, "Just a few years ago, we succeeded in piecing together from a large number of tablets the complete story of an ancient Sumerian myth. I used to call it the Darwinian theory of the Sumerians. The myth must have been widely circulated, for many copies of it have already come to light. In common with the biblical story, a woman plays the dominant role, just as Eve did. But the resemblance ends there. Poor Eve has been damned by all subsequent generations for her deed, while the Babylonians thought so much of their own woman ancestress that they defied her." Now, as I read these other myths, it was apparent that the archetypical woman in ancient religions, as presented by the goddess, was quite different in many aspects from the woman Eve. I then observed that many of these origin and creation legends came from the lands of Canaan, Egypt, and Babylon, the very same lands in which the Adam and Eve myth had been developed. The other legends of creation were from the mythical religious literature of the people who did not worship the Hebrew Yahweh Jehovah, but were in fact the closest neighbors of those early Hebrews. Chapter 1, Part 2 of When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone.